you are going to be brought before the synagogues and you're going to be doing this. And we have zero accounts of any of the disciples recanting and saying, hey, I was joking.
Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Stories of John the Baptist being raised from the dead are in Mark chapter 6. Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. Paul raises Eutychus from the dead. Peter raises Tabitha from the dead. In Matthew's gospel, it says all of the saints are raised from their graves and are allegedly seen by people walking around Jerusalem. Although it's not in the New Testament, there are numerous stories about the Virgin Mary appearing before individual people and groups of people. Mm-hmm. Do you believe all of these resurrection stories are all historically accurate and that they actually happened?
Here's a question for you. What would constitute sufficient evidence for you to believe in the resurrection?
A young man named Nate who wants to start a Christian apologetics ministry reached out to me with a debate challenge. I agreed, and we settled on the topic of, did Jesus of Nazareth historically rise from the dead, with Nate taking the position that Jesus did historically rise from the dead, and myself taking the position that Jesus did not rise from the dead and remains dead to this very day. We agreed that each debater would have a 10-minute opening statement followed by 10-minute rebuttal statements. Then the debate would move into a question and answer period where I would ask Nate a question, he would have about a minute to answer that question, and then I would get to rebut Nate's answer to the question, and vice versa, until each debater had the opportunity to ask 5 different questions with answers and rebuttals. I congratulate Nate on stepping into the arena of ideas to defend his Christian faith. Without further ado, here's my debate with Nate.
Wait, we're just totally disorganized here, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're kind of just tossing this thing together, aren't we?
A little bit. Well, you know, I'm prepared, so why don't you start?
All right.
Like, who's Nathan? Or Nate, I guess.
All right. Hey, I'm Nathan. I am the founder of Actually, let's not do that because I haven't actually started the ministry yet, but I'm going to. I'm Nathan. I am a Christian young adult who's been studying the Bible for my entire life. I am not an authority on this topic, so I will be appealing to other authorities while I'm going through this. And I just love debate and love discussing this topic. I want to start by laying down some historical truths that have been widely accepted in both Christian and secular circles. And my first historical truth is Jesus is real. We know this from multiple historical sources outside the Bible. Most well known is, of course, Josephus, who was a Jewish historian who through many of his writings described him as a wise teacher, and that he performed miracles, and that Jesus was called the Messiah, and that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. We also have the writings of Tacitus, who was a Roman historian and senator, who also referred to his crucifixion, and that it was done under Pontius Pilate. We also have a handful of other sources that would attest to this, along with the Synoptic Gospels, that all 4 of them mention his crucifixion and resurrection. And I want to quote a self-proclaimed agnostic atheist, Bart Ehrman, who says, I think the evidence is just so overwhelming that Jesus existed that it's silly to talk about him not existing. I don't know anyone who is a responsible historian who is actually trained in the historical method, or anybody who is a biblical scholar who does this for a living, who gives any credence at all to any of this. Which this brings me to my second point, is that he was crucified. Now, the most prevalent sources of these are found in all 4 of the Synoptic Gospels that mention that he was crucified, and they go into pretty great detail into the last few days of Jesus' life, up to the cross. But that's not the only source. We all have Tacitus, who wrote about Jesus' death during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of Pontius Pilate in the Annals, which is the chronicle of Roman history between 14 and 68 AD. We also have Josephus, who in the Antiquities of the Jews, where he mentions his death and crucifixion, and that it was ordered by Pontius Pilate. We also see details about the crucifixion in the Gospels that add severity to this execution. They mention a scourging or a flogging to be done, which entails being whipped by a flagrum, which was a short whip with several single braided leather thongs of variable lengths, which would include small iron balls or sharp bones. And they would get tied at intervals, and they would beat the condemned man almost to the point of death, literally tearing the skin off the back, commonly exposing bones, including the spine and rib. And then they would have you carry your own cross to where you were crucified, and they would have them nail them to the cross, and they would hang there. The death that it would cause would be asphyxiation, a most horrible way to die. And we know that he died because John writes, "But when the soldiers came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one soldier thrust his lance into his side, and immediately blood and water flowed out." That's in John 19:33 through 34. And I will quote Dr. Antonio Di Bono because he can explain it better than I. He writes, "Jesus had hemothorax, which is in the stillness of the body, had separated out, as they do, into two layers, the heavier red cells below and the light watery plasma above. The hemothorax was the result of the savage flagellation, that is, flogging. The withdrawal of the spear would have been followed first by red blood cells, then by lighter plasma or water. The body of Jesus had been hanging on the cross, dead for some time. Obviously, the fluid must have accumulated during life by a bleeding into the chest cavity, almost certainly due to the savage flagellation or flogging. It is well known that a body in these circumstances, in a still dead body, starts to separate out to sediment, the heavier red cells sinking to the bottom, leaving a much lighter straw-colored fluid, the plasma above. When a hole is made by the spear, the red cells, which John describes as blood, gush out first, followed by the plasma, which John saw as water." End quote. Which John most likely would not have had a medical explanation for this. Church tradition has said it was the sign of the sacraments, but it begs the rational conclusion is that John was simply writing what he saw as an eyewitness. Which brings me to my third point, and that is Jesus was put in a tomb, which most skeptics and historians have stated that crucifixion victims were typically thrown into unmarked graves or thrown into the trash heaps outside the city, which is correct for most victims and was widely accepted until somewhat recently when a body of a crucified victim was found in a tomb. Professors Craig Evans, Shimeon Gibson, and Byron McCain all agree that the practices of chucking one into an unmarked grave or not burying one in relatively peaceful times around Jerusalem would have been highly unlikely. And with the testimony of the Gospels writers naming Joseph of Arimathea as a member of the Sanhedrin, who would have most likely been at Jesus' trials as being the one to go before Pilate and request the body of Jesus and buries him, and not one of his loyal disciples. Which leads me to my fourth point, which is that the tomb was well guarded and still found empty. For this point, I'd like to quote the late Michael Grant, who was a self-proclaimed skeptic. "Even if the historian chooses to regard the useful apparition as extra-historical, he cannot justifiably deny the empty tomb. True, this discovery, as so often, is described differently by the various Gospels, as critical pagans early pointed out. But if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary source, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. Since we established that Jesus was a real person, that he died of crucifixion, and that he was put in a tomb, and that the tomb was found a few days later empty. Now we know the body wasn't just simply stolen because there was a guard, most likely temple guards. Matthew 27:62 through 66 states, "The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, 'Sir, we remember that the impostor said, while he was still alive, after 3 days I will arise. Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead, and the last fraud will be worse than the first.' Pilate said to them, 'You have a guard of soldiers. Go make it as secure as you can.' So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the tomb and setting a guard." Excuse me. Matthew tells us that they made it as secure as they could. So there's no way that the disciples are stealing the body without a big fight. And that would have most likely been recorded and reported all over Jerusalem and the rest of Israel. Which moves me to my final point, is that the disciples saw something that inspired them to share the news of the risen Savior, which in that time period, it wouldn't have fit in the Jews' conception of the coming Savior. Many skeptics try to say that Jesus was turned into an embellished with a legend, and that would make sense accept the fact that legends need time to develop. If you were to look at the book of 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5, there is a part of a creed that Paul was given before he wrote his letter to Corinthians that reads, Christ died for our sins, according to the scripture, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day, according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Gerd Luhmann says, the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, no later than 3 years, and the formation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, falls in the time between 30 and 33 CE. And N.T. Wright states as well, this is the kind of foundation story which a community is not at liberty to tamper. It was probably formulated within the first 2-3 years after Easter itself, since it was already in formulaic form when Paul received it. Which leads to the most rational conclusion, is that Jesus' body wasn't stolen, and the tomb was found empty, and that he indeed was resurrected from the dead. That is my opening statement.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Nathan, listen, I didn't know anything about you, and I really didn't know what you were going to talk about. I thought you were going to talk about prophecy. You didn't do that.
I was initially, and then I kind of changed it up a little bit when I was doing more research into the topic.
Okay. I'm going to get started. As a learning point, I was a police supervisor, and part of the job of a supervisor is to try and make their people better, the best police officers and detectives that they could be. So sometimes that's a little uncomfortable, but I would suggest the topic of the debate is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And as a learning point, that you have done a really good job of showing that Jesus was a real person, that he was executed by crucifixion, and that he was buried. But I would say if we were in a court of law right now, I would ask that the judge dismiss all the charges, because maybe you'll do this in the rebuttal, but it is about Jesus rising from the dead, not whether he was crucified or died. So I would just make that point to make that your case in chief. But you did with the Corinthian Creed, that is some evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. So I don't want to be all Mr. Negative or anything, but I just say this as a, I don't know, just natural for me to go, hey, you could really nail down this rose from the dead thing, as opposed to, okay, well, anyway, I'm going to shut up now.
You're good. Well, my goal was to lay out a list of accepted truths that we would both agree on, that would then march down to a conclusion of where there's only really one option for this, like that he wasn't stolen, and that he was, and that the tomb was empty. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, I will have a few things to say about that, but this is my turn to present my case as to why, I don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay. So anyway, it's my conclusion the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth is not a historical event. I will provide evidence the stories of his resurrection are most likely legendary lies told by early Christians for profit and prestige. I'll also provide evidence some of Jesus' closest followers doubted his resurrection. I am going to quote the New Testament a few times, maybe a lot, but I don't want that to be interpreted that I believe any of it has any credibility. I'm a retired police sergeant with over 30 years of law enforcement experience. I've written and approved thousands of police reports, and it would be my professional opinion that the stories in the New Testament, when compared to a modern day police report, are woefully incompetent. Even if God exists, rising from biological death is extraordinarily unlikely. The system designed by the creator of the universe does not include people dying and then coming back to life after they've died and then ascending up into the sky from the ground. That is simply not what God designed. The authors of these ancient books, called the New Testament, were superstitious. They were influenced by Greek mythology and Roman paganism. They had an ignorant understanding of the natural world, and their stories that they wrote are in direct conflict with known facts. I'll just list a few of the many New Testament stories to demonstrate the ancient author's ignorance. Luke's birth narrative of Jesus matter-of-factly includes an ancient ceremony in which 2 pigeons are slaughtered because Mary has given birth to a healthy baby boy. That is superstition. The book of Acts contains a lot of sorcery. Peter cures sick people by touching them with his shadow. Paul makes magical illness-curing handkerchiefs just by touching them. In one scene, Paul blinds the sorcerer Elymas with a magical curse. These are examples of sorcery in the New Testament. Both Luke and Matthew write stories about voices coming from the sky. Visions are seen up in the sky. A blanket of food descends from the sky. God's throne is described as being in the sky, and Jesus ascends into the sky. The mistaken idea of a heavenly realm in the sky is influenced by mythology and an ignorant understanding of the natural world. There is nothing above the clouds except freezing, empty space. It is my first argument. Early Christians exaggerated the resurrection for profit and prestige. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul writes a whole chapter describing the apostles financially supporting themselves and their wives from church funds. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 13 through 14. If early Christians were receiving their living from preaching the gospel, then they had a financial incentive to exaggerate. The more people joining the church, the more people tithing, and the more money for the church and its leadership. Acts of the Apostles describes a Christian community laying their money at the feet of Peter and John, 2 of the most important leaders in church history. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had a need. According to Paul's letter in 1 Corinthians, Peter and John get to keep some of that money. It's also important to note the amount of prestige associated with wealthy church members laying their money at Peter and John's feet. This demonstrates Christian leadership was enjoying real power, and power is something that they specifically wanted. The Last Supper story from Luke's Gospel describes the apostles arguing with each other about who would become the most powerful. They wanted power, and by proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus, they obtained the power that they wanted. In Acts chapter 10, we see a scene of the Roman centurion Cornelius bowing down to Peter's feet and inviting him to stay in his home. Peter started as a Galilean fisherman, and because he preached the gospel, he became an honored guest in the home of a powerful Roman centurion. That is prestige, and it's also a reason to exaggerate. These are just a few of the financial and prestigious benefits these former fishermen received from preaching the gospel. Modern celebrity apologists will immediately argue that the apostles actually died for their faith. Nobody would die for a lie. I'm short on time, but will say that the apostles dying for their faith is an exaggeration, and it cannot be demonstrated. In his popular book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Frank Turek over and over again describes the evidence in favor of Christianity as well beyond a reasonable doubt. Well beyond a reasonable doubt? We have evidence even Jesus' own disciples doubted his resurrection. In Mark's gospel, nobody actually sees a risen Jesus. A young man inside the tomb tells the women, Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter. He is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Matthew's gospel picks up where Mark's gospel left off. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. That's Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 through 17. It says some doubted. Thus, we have evidence some of Jesus' 11 disciples had doubts at this particular event on a mountain in Galilee. Luke is described by celebrity apologists as a master historian who carefully investigated everything and wrote an orderly report. Modern Christian authors have written entire books describing how Luke is so precise that questioning his historical accuracy would be absurd. Well then, Luke's orderly report has a story of a resurrected Jesus appearing inside a house in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is 80 miles or a 2 or 3 day walk from a mountain in Galilee. It says, while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. Jesus said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I, myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he had said this to them, he showed them his hands and feet, and they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement. Luke, the master historian, documents what the disciples were thinking and what they concluded. They thought they saw a ghost. The ghost talked to them, and because of joy and amazement, they still did not believe it. Luke, the precise master historian, literally wrote, they did not believe it. I have a question for Frank Turek. How is the evidence of Jesus' resurrection overwhelmingly beyond a reasonable doubt when we have evidence Jesus' own inner circle are doubting in Galilee and not believing in Jerusalem? We have evidence directly from the New Testament. The early Christians who proclaimed the gospel were benefiting both financially and with prestigious honors. Other followers of Jesus who were right there at the time had doubts or did not believe he rose from the dead. Resurrecting from biological death is extraordinarily unlikely. The best explanation for Jesus disappearing almost 2,000 years ago is he died by Roman crucifixion and he stayed dead. My time is too short to talk about the forgery called John's Gospel, or to bring up the empty tomb, which was not empty, or to demonstrate how narcissistic first century self-promoter Paul has no credibility. I've just touched the surface of this debate. My YouTube channel, Sergeant Skeptic, has numerous videos which fill in the gaps that I don't have time for now. That's what I have for you, Nathan.
All right. I obviously disagree with a lot of that, if not.
Sure, of
almost
course.
the entirety.
We wouldn't be here if we all agreed it. Well, maybe we
I
would,
know,
but
like,
we
what
would
was-
not be disagreeing.
it would be a short debate. Okay, so you make a lot of claims about New Testament stuff, but one thing is that we know that the discovery of the tomb is attested to at least 6 sources in the New Testament, which they're extremely early in time compared to most historian figures have. Like, most commonly we bring up one of the most gold standards of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, like, I might be mistaken, our earliest source for his life was written about 400 years, or is dated to about 400 years after Alexander the Great. And we see that we have disciples and apostles. And First Clement mentions the death of both Paul and Peter, and that was written probably very, very early second century, if not right before the turn of the century during that. And if the tomb was really empty, why didn't the Romans and the Jewish authorities just reveal a body? It would have been the easiest thing to ever debunk, is just, here's the body. Now, people are, and you brought up this, that people are unwilling to die for a lie. If it was a lie, then they truly believed it. Like, I don't know how much money you're going to need to offer these guys to give them that they're going to go into death and crucifixion and torture, knowing that, hey, I am going to die for this, but I'll get prestige and money. I mean, if you're a con man, your whole goal is to stay alive and collect. But from church tradition and historical sources, we have, they didn't. They didn't have the chance to stay alive. Now, I know a lot of arguments are, it was like, well, how do we know that them recanting was going to save their life to begin with? But it doesn't answer the question of, they still didn't. In fact, Paul's writings, most of his writings, come from a jail cell in Rome. That is attested to in the New Testament. I forget which chapter and verse. And Acts talks about the life of Paul afterwards, in the Acts of the Apostles during. Now, Acts was written by Luke, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke, which then ends right before Paul's execution, which a lot of people have dated. This is a poor opening argument.
We're doing rebuttal. You're doing fine. You're hitting all kinds of points, and you'll work on your articulation. So keep going.
Yeah. And we know that that was brought before Paul's death by First Clement, and we have other sources, because Paul's death was attested to in Roman historians. And so seeing those, my articulation's horrible.
Yeah, but that's why you get better at this. Trust me, you will get better at this, okay? I didn't come out with my first phone call to Patrick Madrid and sound like I knew what I was talking about. So you're okay.
Who's Patrick Madrid?
He's a Catholic guy that I debate every once in a while over the phone, you know.
Okay. Would you have a problem with me taking a second to articulate a little bit better and then redoing my opening rebuttal?
Yeah, if you want to, go ahead. I have a couple of comments already. I don't know if you want to let me jump in. I'll leave it up to you. Or if you want a couple minutes to get your thoughts together, or if I could jump in about a couple of the things that I want to say that you've already kind of touched on.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Well, let's see. I'll make this quick, because you did touch on a lot of things, and I do have a rebuttal thing about First Clement. Listen, I think this is an interesting thing and something to read, but in First Clement chapter 5, you know, he does write about the death of Paul and Peter, and he even kind of alludes to that possibly they were martyred. Now, I'm going off memory a little bit. It doesn't directly state, and it's a story that they are dead. So, you know,
it doesn't state how they die. It states that they died, that they did die, yeah.
Yeah, that they died, but it kind of alludes to that, hey, you know, they were definitely persecuted and jailed and chained and stuff like this. He puts that in there. So I think this is interesting, and I don't discount it. The thing is though that, you know, the First Clement did not make it into the Bible. It's my understanding that it was considered in the Bible. Ultimately, they rejected it. So I don't think you can see, it does account for the death of Peter and Paul, but not necessarily how they died. The big problem I have with my rebuttal to your comments about they knew they were going to die, I reject that. The New Testament, the book of Acts, and Paul's epistles indicate that the apostles actually were practicing the faith and evangelizing for over 30 years. So they start evangelizing, and I don't want to discount this. I absolutely believe that they were taking risks with evangelizing. Anytime some new religion is formed, the people of the old religion are going to get angry and upset, and they were living in a very barbaric and violent time where, you know, people were angry and upset. And there are stories, you know, the stoning death of Stephen, the kind of vaguely described execution of James, that people were being killed for. If you look at these stories closely, I think Stephen is actually stoned to death because he makes them mad, not from proclaiming the gospel, but from accusing the Jews of being murderers. That's what Peter accuses them. At any rate, they didn't necessarily know they were going to die for proclaiming the gospel. They preached that for over 30 years, and we don't have any accounts of their death. So, you know, my view is they were immediately getting prestige and money from preaching the gospel. And they were taking some risks, yes, for sure.
Yeah.
But they didn't die or necessarily even know they were going to be killed. And they did this for a long period of time. So I do kind of push back on that. So maybe, I don't know, that's just what I wanted to say. I'll mark that off my list. I have other things on my list, but this is really your time. So I want to let you get back at it if you'd like.
Yeah.
And I have a rebuttal, though. I still get my
I know.
rebuttal time.
Yeah. I just wanted to I didn't really write too much of a rebuttal. I wrote some things because I was like wondering where you were going to come in at this.
Yeah, sure.
And so,
well, you can, I mean, my rebuttal might be short. You did give me a lot of things that I want to refute, though. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll leave it up to you how much time you need or want. But I would like to spend a little time rebutting some of your case in chief.
Okay. I need to get myself a glass of water really quick.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah. I learned from, see, this is something you're going to learn. Always have a glass of water with you.
Yeah.
I have two glasses
All right.
of water with me. Go
Let
for
me
it.
get some water, and then a couple minutes of me to reread through my notes really quick, and then, all right, so we'll say this is the start of my rebuttal.
Sure.
So you make the claim that the tomb is not empty, which we have 6 sources, independent sources in the New Testament. Now, you also denied the validity of the New Testament, but that truly, in a way, doesn't matter in the scheme of things when it comes to historical commentary, because of how early these were and that these claim to be. Now, to deny eyewitness, you would need a good amount of proof. Now, you bring in superstition. Now, my response to that is, well, if we're talking about a God who came and the life of his son who comes down and is healing people, and it is very, like, in a way, superstitious because it's not natural. Like, you can't naturally explain the healings and the actions of the Son of God. It would be a very superstitious thing to be mentioning. And you also mentioned the ignorance about nature and how how Luke and other disciples would not have had a great understanding of the natural world. And I would respond, yeah, they didn't have a telescope, or they did have telescopes, but they didn't have the same types of tools and stuff that we have today. They did have a great understanding, like when we think about old time people and how they were stonehead or something, like where they still had a pretty good understanding of nature. Now, maybe they didn't understand outer space and stuff like the way we do now, which is expected. But I would argue that the lack of understanding of the natural world to how we see it is just a first century understanding of how the world works. And you bring up that disciples and apostles are looking for prestige and money and honor. And it's like, yes, there was a lot of great donors, but that wasn't their goal. We see that there is a complete change in the way the disciples are. The Gospels mention very embarrassing stories and facts of the disciples. Like, you see doubting Thomas refuses to believe unless he can stick his hands in Jesus, the wounds in his hand and his sides. And we see Peter rejecting to know who Jesus was. 3 times. And we see that even the embarrassment of first century women, not that they were the first ones to see. And not only that, one of these women was possessed by demons at some point in time. The gospel says that she was possessed by 7 demons at one point in time. And so you've already got 2 strikes against you for validity. You have, first off, you're being recorded by women who are reporting this, and one of them was demon possessed. And then we bring into the other one is that they are the way you would debunk this is all you need to do is produce a body. And if the tomb is empty, or if the tomb is not empty as you claim, then why don't they just pull out the body and be like, hey, this is the body of the guy. See, he's still here. He's been stabbed through the side. He's got all this stuff. He is still here. He's still in the tomb. The tomb is sealed. And that would have pretty much debunked pretty much any comeback or start of it. But they didn't. In fact, the chief priests and stuff, they come up with a statement saying, the disciples have come and stolen the body away. That's an admission that it's empty. And so we see that, and then we see that the apostles are going into great risks. They're traveling around. We're talking about Jews who absolutely despised Gentiles and anyone who wasn't a Jew to go into non-Jewish occupied territories and bringing the gospel to them as brothers. Now, there is conflict between Peter and other ones because they're still fighting their own raised biases and how they view Gentiles and non-Jews at the time. And they go to great risk. Like First Clement mentions the death of Paul and Peter of being a most strenuous death. And we see others, like you brought up in a little bit, of Stephen and other people who, the only one that I would say didn't die of persecution was John. And we see that Jesus, he said you are going to be persecuted. You are going to be brought before the synagogues, and you're going to be doing this. And we have 0 accounts of any of the disciples recanting and saying, hey, I was joking. This was just for money. And so I would argue that they didn't do it for just money and prestige. Now, money and prestige comes in as charity, and they were sending it to Christians all over the Roman Empire. And prestige often comes with great speakers and people who God has blessed during those times. And I would say a lot of the time we're talking about something that is happening that can't just be explained by a natural perspective. Like, we can't just go in and explain naturally how John or how the disciples are healing someone and how Jesus is healing someone in these circumstances, because it is a divine claim. And so it's really hard to go and assert a naturalistic explanation to why these are. And my question is, how did we get such a turn of these men that they're so bold? They've been emboldened to pursue this, even into persecution and against their own raised teachings and biases. And I think that's my rebuttal.
Okay.
I threw in First Clement in there because we discussed it, and I thought I would still keep my point in there.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point to make, to bring up First Clement. I would just say, hey, that was one of the books that actually was rejected from the New Testament.
Of course.
Okay, so now this would be my turn to rebut some of the things you said. So I do have some things to say about that. I'm going to start with this whole empty tomb thing because I think that's kind of interesting. I did make this vague kind of claim the tomb was not empty. I'm going to stick by that claim.
Okay.
The tomb wasn't empty. Luke's gospel, now he is described as this master historian who's totally precise with his details. So I think it's important to understand a first century tomb that, yes, the Joseph of Arimathea's tomb is described as a family tomb, but they didn't just have a tomb in the first century. That we've uncovered these tombs. They put a lot of different bodies in these tombs. So a family tomb might have all of the deceased family members in that tomb, and there were little niches cut out of the rock that they would lay the body in. So a private tomb would be something that, I'm not saying that they didn't have private tombs. I'm saying that's not the norm. That's not what we've uncovered in archaeological digs. Luke is the one who kind of gives some information that the tomb is not empty. Now, I think the tomb, I don't think Luke really knows anything. I think he's getting this, Jesus was buried in a tomb of Joseph of Arimathea as a legendary source, but he's writing about his understanding of a tomb. And he says the women arrive at the tomb, and the two men dressed in gleaming white there say, "Why do you look for the living amongst the dead?" Now, this is some evidence that in Luke's mind, there are dead people in that tomb, or you wouldn't say, "Why do you look for the living amongst the dead?" Amongst the dead indicates that there's dead folks there. Mark's gospel has a young man in the tomb when the women show up. So, it's a minor point. It's not like saying that Jesus was in there. Here's the thing. If you look at the book of Acts, Jesus appears before his apostles. If I'm correct, and Jesus was crucified and buried somehow. Now, Paul, very early on, this Corinthian creed does give some evidence that very early on there was this creed about Jesus being buried. I don't want to deny that. However, the book of Acts indicates that the apostles spent 40 days with Jesus while he was alive. Now, I say if that's just a legendary story, which I think it is, I don't think he spent 40. I think he was dead, buried, probably in just some pit somewhere, but buried, and it seems that's early. Well, then his body would have been decomposing for a minimum of 40 days before anyone would have heard any evangelization, would have heard any claims of him rising for the dead. So if he's dead, the book of Acts indicates a 40-day time period. Well, I'm not saying his body would be unrecognizable. But Lazarus is buried in a tomb as well. And there's information that Lazarus was already beginning to smell after 4 days. So you would have 40 days of composition taking place in a tomb that, according to Luke, has other bodies in it as well. I don't think that it's just this simple matter of walking over to the tomb, if you even knew where it was, and saying, "Oh, well, Jesus is still here," because Jesus and the other bodies in there would have been in states of decomposition that would make their identification difficult, if not impossible. And I think we kind of have to take that into consideration. Let's see. You were talking about Jesus's crucifixion and really hitting on that it was this horrible, painful death that he experienced. Now, I believe that that's very true, and I don't think Jesus did anything to deserve that punishment. I think he probably was a little bit more of an insurgent, or his followers were a little bit more of insurgents, and that's maybe why the Romans decided to crucify him, but that's speculation on my part. However, Luke's gospel indicates that Jesus is walking, he's talking to people, he's turning around to make some statements towards the women that are following his crucifixion march. I mean, he's not like on death's door, at least according to Luke's gospel in this. It doesn't really even seem to be hurt that badly after this scourging. You mentioned Antonio de Bono. I might be mispronouncing that. And if I'm correct on who Antonio de Bono is, he is a pathologist, somebody with an enormous amount of experience in autopsies and in examining people who have died in a wide variety of circumstances. I think he's a medical examiner with thousands of cases of autopsy that he's personally done. So somebody with great knowledge, but he is also a very deep believing, biased Christian. And I think he makes the same mistake that you make, that a lot of Christians have made when they're talking about Jesus's actual injuries and how, yes, it's medically possible blood and water came out of Jesus. And they're missing the whole point. The blood and water coming out of Jesus is not a physical event, it's theological. Jesus is full of this living water. That's what he tells the woman at the well in the conversation at the woman of the well. But it's all over John's gospel. This is a theological thing, that when Jesus is stabbed by the sword in John chapter 19, or the spear in John chapter 19, this water and blood coming out of him, the author's mind, in my opinion, my view, is he's not thinking about blood and water actually expelling from Jesus. And blood coming out of Jesus is actually a sign of a heartbeat, that he isn't even dead yet. But that's theological. That's the living water and the blood of salvation that's coming out of Jesus. That's my kind of sort of pushback on that. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying that's something that a lot of scholars believe, that it's theological. And Antonio de Bono, for all his knowledge of autopsies, doesn't really seem to have that particular theology right, in my opinion. You mentioned John's gospel. I have a whole video on John's gospel. I do not believe in any way, shape, or form that John was John, the son of Zebedee, one of the fishermen that was recruited by Jesus on the shores of Galilee. Not the same author as that gospel. That gospel was written by a later wealthy and powerful theologian who knew how to read and write. Yes, John could have learned how to read and write, but that takes money. It takes tutors. It takes the equipment to learn how to read and write, a big endeavor in the first century. And every time that John's gospel uses the first person to describe himself, John, he puts him outside of one of Jesus's disciples, and he uses third person. Christians immediately say that, oh, well, this is a writing style. And I would immediately say, no, it's not. The other, Paul doesn't use third person to describe himself. He uses first person exclusively. The author of John's gospel writes in the third person because I don't think he was present at the scenes. And occasionally he writes in the first person. And every time he does that, he actually removes himself so that we may believe, is something that you're going to find in John chapter 20. He's saying, so that we may believe, that I'm one of the we. I want to believe that's why these things were written down. That's a long discussion. I'm just making this point. We could talk for a whole hour on that. And I'm sure, skilled, scholarly apologists would absolutely disagree with me on that. But I don't think John was present at the scenes that he records. I think he was writing down oral traditions. Let's see. You talked a lot about the guards in Matthew's gospel. Matthew's gospel is the only gospel that has guards in it. And it's kind of a little bit of a dumb story, because these guards are supposed to go and tell the Jewish leadership that, oh yeah, we fell asleep, and while we were asleep, the apostles came and stole the body. Well, I mean, what kind of silliness is this? How are sleeping guards supposed to know who stole the body? The Corinthian Creed. You did what every celebrity apologist does with this Corinthian Creed, and you leave out verses 12 through 14. How can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. Look, Paul is writing about these 500 witnesses, and Paul and Peter, or not Paul, Paul is writing Peter and James seeing the risen Jesus, 500 witnesses seeing the risen Jesus. But the point is that in Paul's mind, the Corinthians don't believe in the general resurrection of the dead. And in his mind, in Paul's mind, he's saying, well, if you don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, then you don't believe in Jesus's resurrection, and our faith is in vain. Whatever it is that the Corinthians don't believe, the author of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 thinks that that destroys Christianity. So we have also evidence that people are not necessarily believing Paul, and that evidence gets a lot stronger when we start reading 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul is really, his relationship with the Corinthian church has deteriorated. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 10, they write, in person, he is powerful and strong, but when he's writing his letters are bold and powerful, but in person, he is unimpressive and his speaking amounts to nothing. This is clear evidence that in Paul's mind, the Corinthians are insulting him. They don't believe him. And he's writing about that. And he's very angry about it because just in the next couple of sentences, he starts these veiled threats. So you kind of mentioned, these big life changes that the earlier followers of Christianity have. And I would say, well, as far as Paul is concerned, it didn't change his constitution at all. He was this kind of violent extremist saying that he's going around persecuting the church and tormenting people who were Christians. And then after his conversion, he basically is doing the exact same thing. It doesn't change his personality. Christianity does nothing to make him a kinder, gentler person. He's going around busting people's heads and threatening them because they don't believe what he tells them to believe. So Paul thinks highly of himself. And the Corinthians didn't really seem to give him any credibility. So I'm wondering why it is that we give him any credibility. Your apostles' timeline, I think I already mentioned that. They were practicing their religion for over 30 years. So I think I already talked about that. I won't be redundant. You mentioned Paul, his execution, and he's in a jail cell. No, Paul has a get out of jail free card. He uses that card. They want to throw him in a jail cell, but he pulls out his Roman citizenship, get out of jail free card. And all of a sudden, when we read this story in Acts, all of a sudden now Paul's the person in power that the people who wanted to arrest him, they're afraid of him. Like, oh my gosh, we just belittled and arrested this Roman citizen. We're in a lot of trouble now. And when the book of Acts ends, the very last couple of phrases of the book of Acts, it has Paul living in a rented house, proclaiming the gospel with boldness and without hindrance. And anybody that wants to come see him can come see him. So this is the last of the church history that we have. And according to Paul, he's doing just fine. And we don't see this impending doom that all these Christian apologists are talking about, that, he's about to be executed and all that. That's just not there. And First Clement, he's died at that time. And so I would push back that, Paul was some kind of beaten, jailed martyr. He's got to get out of jail free card, and he uses it. Then also the apostles, I always think that their lives were radically changed when they met Jesus on the shores of Galilee. I mean, they left their fishing businesses. It seems like Peter had a little family fishing business going on, might have been doing actually okay, but I think fishing is dangerous and hard work. But he has a house, he's got a wife, so maybe he was doing all right. And that was a radical change because they just drop everything and they go follow Jesus, which is very interesting. But I would say that no, Peter wanted power. And I would say that his life wasn't changed because of the resurrection. The resurrection for Peter was that Jesus was now out of the way. Jesus was gone. Now Peter is going to be the one who carries on the church. And I think if we read the famous story of Ananias and Sapphira, which in my opinion, every Christian has been completely duped into saying this is some kind of lying to the Holy Spirit. Peter's a cult leader. I mean, he's involved in public deaths of people. He mocks Sapphira before she dies. He mocks Ananias after he dies, and he spreads this great fear throughout the church. I mean, and people are laying money at his feet. These are attributes of a cult leader, not some, charismatic. They are a charismatic cult leader, but not some gentle, kind, loving evangelist for Jesus. It's just, I'm not seeing that in the personality of Peter. Let's see. You brought up doubting Thomas. I would just maybe say, hey, look at doubting Thomas. He refused to believe any of this until he saw it himself. Well, then why shouldn't we demand the same amount of evidence that Thomas demanded? I mean, this is the demand he makes. I mentioned the first century. I mentioned the Corinthian Creed, first century burial. You said that they didn't recant their testimony. I say some of the recanting is directly in the original stories in Matthew's gospel. Some of them doubted in Luke's gospel. They didn't believe it at all, according to Luke. Now, I understand that they're going to be amazed seeing a guy die or knowing a person die of crucifixion, and you then see that person. But this is doubt that is it's documented. Matthew and Luke both document it. They document it in different places at different times. So this is two different authors documenting doubt in Galilee and in Jerusalem, two different places. And it has to be over a course of at least a couple of days, because those places, they got to walk in the first century 80 miles. I mean, if they're hustling, athletic young men could maybe walk 80 miles in 3 days, something like that. So they have all this time to think about what's going on. And ultimately, Luke writes, they didn't believe it. So I think the doubt is right there, and that we have some people stayed with this idea that Jesus rose from the dead, and other people left it and dropped off. Here, we only hear about the people who stayed with it, and it'd be my view that those people benefited from proclaiming the resurrection, and at least some of them, the leader, Peter, seems to be somewhat of a cult leader to me, and he wanted power according to these reports that we have in the gospel. So I guess those are the rebuttal things to what you were talking about that I would have. I mean, we're not going to resolve this whole issue today, but those are my comments. Those are my comments.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so that's rebuttals. I think you kind of toasted me in the rebuttals, but.
Well, I'm a lot older than you, and you mentioned you were 21. I've been studying this for over 20 years. So when I started studying this, you were a babe in your mom's arms. So I've had a little advantage, okay? But that doesn't mean in 20 years from now that you won't be, doing a really good job defending your faith.
Hey, I'm working on it, man. Yeah. All right.
And I'm impressed by that. Listen, I'm impressed by that. You go out, you take some risks, and maybe somebody gets the better of you, and maybe not. I mean, that's for the audience to decide, not for me or you to decide. But the fact that you're here means that you're going to be better at this the next time you do it.
Yeah, of course. Hopefully, you always want to build upon what you've already done, but you need to do something before you can build on it.
Yeah.
All right. So, and then we're now cross-examination.
We kind of had this sort of vague agreement, cross-examination. We would ask each other questions.
Okay. So my first question is, how did Paul get away with appealing to over 500 witnesses, who most of which were still alive at the time, if he was making it all up?
Yeah, okay, so I think that people tend to fudge a little bit. I think that the Corinthian Creed is very interesting. There's a book by Justin Bass called The Bedrock of Christianity, The Case for Christ's Resurrection, or something like that, where he goes into great detail about the Corinthian Creed. And I almost think maybe you've read that book, but you're hitting some of the points that he does in this book. It's a pretty good book. My whole beef with the Corinthian Creed is verses 12 through 14, and then in 2 Corinthians, and I already mentioned that I don't think Paul has any credibility. I'm very unimpressed with this guy. I ultimately think he's a self-promoting narcissist. However, we hear that Paul, they could go check it out. And I think there's this huge assumption in Christian apologetics that Paul is making this bold claim. There's 500 witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. You could just go check that out yourself. Well, how do you know that people didn't go check it out? It's 800 miles. So if you look at a map, it's 800 miles from Corinth to Jerusalem. So, hey, just going down the street and checking it out. No, it's actually kind of a difficult and dangerous journey. Paul himself writes about being shipwrecked and being caught in all these storms. So it's not like, super easy to go check it out. But there's this assumption that they didn't check it out. Because when you look at 1 Corinthians, there's a tumultuous relationship between Paul and the Corinthians, and they're not really buying everything that Paul is selling, which is why he writes 12 through 14. He's mad at them. There's some sexual sin going on in the church. Members of the church are suing one another. There's multiple problems. He's writing this letter to try and straighten those problems out, but he's mad about this Corinthian, them not believing in resurrections of the dead. And then by 2 Corinthians, the thing is totally deteriorated. Now he's threatening them. They're calling him unimpressive and amounting to nothing. We're making this assumption that no Corinthian, got some news from Jerusalem via the shipping routes that were there that possibly, that they knew nothing about it. My view is that the people in Jerusalem probably would have not known anything about Jesus at that time when Paul was writing this. that Corinthian creed was a very early creed. I mean, Justin Bass argues that maybe within days of Jesus's crucifixion, they were talking about that. I'm not necessarily thinking it's that soon, but it's possible that these resurrection stories, I think it was more like months before people were sort of saying, hey, Jesus is still there. We saw this ghost and we're overjoyed at seeing this ghost. And yeah, we think it was a ghost, but Jesus is alive up in heaven and we're joyful because of that. And then that gets fudged a little bit to where we have this bodily resurrection down the road. But no, my claim on this, it would have been difficult for Corinthians to check out Paul's claim because of the 800-mile difference, or it's like 1,500 miles if they take the sea route or land route over Turkey. But maybe they did, and that's why they're so upset with Paul, and they're just basically discounting him as unimpressive and amounting to nothing. That's what he writes that they're telling him. So I don't know if I've answered your question. You get to rebut that, though. You get to rebut my answer if you want to. We agreed to that.
Yes. I would say that the Corinthians, they were a church in Corinth that was going through some sexual and a lot of other evil sins that were going on in the church, and Paul was essentially calling them out, being like, hey guys, we need to stop this. And you brought up Corinthians 11 through 14, and it's a great passage. I love that passage because it puts so much weight on the resurrection. It's essentially saying, hey, if this didn't happen, nothing else matters. Like, you're right in pointing out where if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, Christianity is void. Like, our faith means nothing if Jesus didn't rise. Mm-hmm. And so I would agree with that, and I don't think it's Paul stating it to because they're doubting the fact that it is. And the 500 eyewitnesses, it's the writings and the letters weren't just only brought to Corinth; they were also sent throughout, like the Corinthian churches and the churches of Galatia and all this. They would take the letters and they would copy them and send them on to other people. And so not only could the people in Corinth go and check to see, hey, is this real? But it could also be, say, the letter goes to Jerusalem or something like that. They can also verify. And I think that just claiming to 500 eyewitnesses, it's a lot easier to claim 500 witnesses who are long dead than to claim to 500 witnesses that are there, because someone can always go and double check your claims on this. And I think that was the appeal Paul was making. Hey, if you can, go check this out. Prove that this is true. That would be my rebuttal for your answer.
Okay. I want to get to endless rebuttals. I mean, I have things to say, but let me ask a question now. And we kind of said you get a minute to rebut it. I get a minute to ask the question. You get a minute to, so we're kind of done with that. Moving on. Is that cool with you? Yeah. Or else we could talk about this particular thing for like the next 6 hours.
Yeah.
I made my point. You made yours. So when did you begin to believe in Christianity, and when did you begin to believe Christianity was true, and why?
So I was raised in a Christian household. I would say I've always believed that Jesus rose from the dead and that Jesus was real and that the Bible is true. I wasn't saved and I didn't have a firm faith in it. I always believed it as historical. And until maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, when I started actually looking into my own faith and looking into this and actually studying more into it. Like, my historical knowledge of the Bible comes more from that time period of where I'm looking at this and being like, okay, if this should be kind of simple to see or not, and seeing that the amount of details and stuff that the Bible brings in. And so I would say I've always believed that the Bible is true. And but I verified that later on, about 4 or 5 years ago, looking through, like, is this what I actually believe, through things I saw in other people in my work and regular daily life, I would say.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. I mean, my story is, I do get a little bit of time to rebut that. I'm not going to rebut that because that's your feeling. So I
Yeah.
can't rebut you. My own experience, I grew up in a non-religious home. I grew up as a latchkey kid, no father in the house, just me and my mom and my sister. I never had any experiences with religion at all. I became a soldier, was in the California Army National Guard, became a police officer. And my first real experience, outside of just a few comments as a teenager, some of my friends were born again Christians, but I didn't really know anything about it. But, I didn't realize this. Me and my wife, she was born and raised in the Salvation Army, and, like, kind of living a secular life during our dating adventures in our early marriage. But as soon as that first child came along, my wife's like, hey, I'm going back to church. I'm taking our young daughter to church, and I would really like you to come along. So I'm like, absolutely. I know nothing about any of this, but absolutely. I really liked the people there. I'm a pretty modest person. And I like the modest lifestyle. And the Salvation Army is truly about helping people. Like during my work, I was arresting, people for being drunk in public and having all these, accidents and, committing crimes, sometimes crimes of violence because they were drunk and intoxicated. And here the Salvation Army on Sunday was preaching the gospel. And during the week, they were going out and providing the exact same people that I was arresting, services, alcohol, rehabilitation. And I was just like, hey, this is probably a place I need to be. But I was always skeptical. I cannot sit here and say I was a believing Christian. I was I'm not sure exactly how old, 26, 27 years old. My skepticism of being a police officer was highly developed. And when people told me things were true, I liked and trusted those folks. But I still had this skeptical thing. Retirement, I wanted to know if it was true. I had a very clean slate. I started with no knowledge at all. I was an adult, not a child, so I could really evaluate this, I think, fairly and objectively. I say I kind of wanted it to be true. I didn't have a lot of investment whether it was true or not, but my wife is the most beautiful Christian woman you'll ever meet. And she believes it's true to this day, like more than anything. She wants you to win this debate. She wants you to evangelize me. She told me that. I hope that guy turns you into a Christian. But this clean slate, I decided, no, this is most likely, we don't know exactly what happened. I'm saying you can't read these reports and determine what happened 2,000 years ago. You can only try to take a wild guess more than anything. But I think it's more likely that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, because if there is a God, that's just not how God operates. And the stories themselves indicate doubt, prestige, and a lot of other problems. So anyway, that's my story. It's different than yours. You get to ask me another question, though.
Okay. Let me see. Here's a question for you. What would constitute sufficient evidence for you to believe in the resurrection?
I think if, it's a good question. Atheists just like totally struggle with this. Like they just like, nothing could, if I believed that John's gospel was reasonably true, it wouldn't have to be word for word true, but I would have to believe that it was reasonably true. I hate to put numbers on things, but maybe if I believed it was like 60% likely that it's true, that I would be a Christian just because it more likely is true than not. But I actually quite firmly believe that it's not true. So I can't be a Christian because I don't believe it. But if I did believe that these stories were reasonably accurate, then I would be a Christian.
Okay. Well, I would say, like, that's why I'm a Christian. I believe they are accurate and they are true, and they are written by reliable eyewitnesses. Because they say at the end of one of the Gospels, this is so that you have reasonable proof that this is true. These events have been written down for you to know that this is true. And so my answer would be, well, I truly believe they are true. And I think that I've got a lot of scholars on my side, and you have a lot of people on your side who say the opposite. Now, you do have credence in saying with the variations in the Gospels and how they're slightly different. Well, they've got lots of differences between them, but I would say that the differences don't necessarily refute one's reliability. Like, as a police officer, if there was a car accident and you have 6 eyewitnesses and you go and ask them, hey, what happened? One of the eyewitnesses might say, oh, it was a blue car racing down and it at 50 miles an hour and ran through a red light. And then you'll have another point who goes like, oh, it was a red car that was running down at like 70 miles an hour, and fortunately the light was green, and but the guy who didn't get out of the way. You'd have these variations, and that wouldn't prove that the accident didn't happen, because it's there, but it wouldn't necessarily disprove the reliability of them. It's just the variations of what was more important to the eyewitness at the time.
Yeah.
And so
it's a fair point. I got to sit, I don't know, these contradictions are this big, huge thing. And like Bart Ehrman is a huge contradiction guy. And I listened to him. What a police officer cannot do is start to speculate to resolve contradictions. A police detective or a police officer who is investigating a case with a contradiction or an apparent contradiction has to go re-interview people. And they have to go try to figure out, why are these people saying different things? And you can't make guesses, but it's hotly. I'd say the most significant contradiction in the Gospels that I'm kind of concerned about. John's Gospel depicts the apostles believing that Jesus rose from the dead immediately, while Luke's Gospel, if you go with what Luke wrote, they don't believe it at all. They kind of think he's a ghost. They're overjoyed and amazed. So in order to resolve this contradiction, did they believe it immediately upon entering the empty tomb, which I don't think was empty, or did they not believe it at all and think Jesus was a ghost? In order to resolve that, we got to go talk to Peter. We got to go talk to whoever John is. He's the other disciple. He's the one whom Jesus loved, all these kind of nicknames that he has. We got to talk to those guys and go, look, tell me what happened. And we can't do that, obviously. And this is why I cannot say that we can figure out what's going on, because our witnesses are all dead. And the reports that we have do have apparent contradictions. And what we cannot do is speculate as to what happened. This is one of the big differences between a police detective and a historian. A historian speculates to try and show what most likely happened, where a police detective has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt what actually did happen. And when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, we cannot do that. So we have to, we don't know. We ultimately don't know, but I think there's all kinds of problems with these stories. The contradictions can be evidence that somebody's telling the truth, that people are actually telling you what they saw from a different angle, different perspective. But it can also be that people are lying. We have contradictions in law enforcement all the time, and sometimes it's because one of the people is actually lying about what they saw. So we can't just guess. Okay, my turn to ask a question.
Go for it.
All right. Let's see. Jesus told the rich man to give all his money to the poor. Jesus said, if anyone sues you for your shirt, you should give him your coat. Jesus said, the first shall become last, and the last shall become first. Jesus said, if you serve money, you hate God. Jesus said, it is more difficult for the rich to get into heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. With these sayings of Jesus that are documented in the Gospels, what's your view on them? What is Jesus talking about?
Yeah. So I would say they are talking about what your priorities are, in a way. So it's like, if my highest priority is making money, my love is for money, my desire is for all this. And talking about the young rich man, young rich man, he came before God, before Jesus, and said, "What must I do to get into heaven?" And Jesus, taking pity upon him, says, "Sell all of your riches, give all your riches to the poor, and follow me." So he's saying, this this is where your priority is now. Give them away and follow me and make me your priority. And so seeing and with the state and with the eye of the needle, it's, if you look at the historic context, the eye of the needle is not a physical needle. It's a doorway they have in walls. It's very, very small, smaller, shorter than a camel is. And so to get a camel down and to get it through that is quite difficult. And so it's not that it's impossible for someone with wealth to get into heaven, but that if their desire is to just have wealth, wealth is their God, wealth is what they want, which often happens. Like, we hear people, it's like, hey, if I just had another $1,000, just had another $1,000, if I just had another dollar, I'd be happy. And they're seeking happiness through, and they're seeking fulfillment through money and through physical and their own means. Well, then how can you put God there? God should be the one who's on that throne, not your money, not anything else. And so I would say it's a condition on to how to be saved is I have to be king. God has to be king on that. So that would be my answer to that.
Yeah. The only thing, I get a little bit of time to rebut that. I'm not really rebutting it. I'm just saying that there's a different, the eye of the needle, you're kind of buying into the idea that the needle is the doorway and this camel would have to squeeze through. It'd be very difficult to do. There's another interpretation that Jesus is actually saying, no, it is impossible for the rich to get into heaven and enter the kingdom of God. That can't be done because a camel could not go through the eye of the needle. That's one interpretation of it. And that wealthy people are looking at this scripture and they're kind of desperate for a way out of it, because Jesus is quite clear to the rich man, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, give your money to the poor and follow me. Those are the clear directions that Jesus is giving him. People don't like that, so they look for reasons not to. With God, all things are possible. So the rich man could get into heaven because with God, all things are possible. But I think that the other context you could interpret this as is that no, Jesus is saying with God, all things are possible. You can give all your money away and follow me. God will make that possible for you if you put God first. And so wealthy people who are interpreting it in a self-serving way, if Christianity is true, they are actually betting their eternal soul that they're getting this right. Because if a rich person cannot get into heaven, they won't get into heaven. And so the safer thing to do, if you really truly believe that Jesus is the Messiah, is to actually give your money to the poor. It's another way of interpreting it. And the stakes, if Christianity is true, are very high. So that's what I would say about your comments about this common doorway thing. At any rate, you get to ask me a question now, unless you wanted to say something. I don't want to have endless rebuttals, but go ahead.
I just want to make a quick comment. And so I would say my answer to why is I don't believe that it's impossible for a rich man to get into heaven if he is a sincere follower. He has the fruits of the Spirit. But I would say that it's harder for a rich man, because when it comes to like praying and seeking guidance from God and stuff, it's easier to see that as someone who doesn't have a ton of wealth and doesn't have it, is that, wow, this is only what God could have done. Versus if I'm wealthy and rich, I can go and pray to God, but then I can go and send money to go and have that problem fixed. And it's like, I fixed it. Like, no need for God here. It's fixed. And so that's my quick.
I think it is your turn to ask a question right now.
Yes. Let me. What other explanation would you give for the rise of Christianity and the belief in the resurrection, given the historical facts of the empty tomb and the appearance and the radical and the radical change in the disciples. I know you attest that the tomb is not empty, but I'll still leave that in there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that, I mean, historically, a lot of religions have come. Christianity happens to be, at least at this particular moment in time, probably the world's biggest religion. But it's also the world's quickest dwindling religion. And it's my understanding, I haven't studied this, that Islam is actually the biggest, the most rapidly growing religion. I've kind of said I don't think the tomb is empty, and I don't think that these apostles necessarily had these radical changes. So to answer your question, the one prophecy in the Bible that kind of catches my attention is the apostles are arrested for preaching in the colonnade. They're not supposed to be doing that. The Jewish Sanhedrin is very angry with them. There's a lot of threats and everything. Peter gives this big speech. Where he tells them, you guys have murdered the prophets, you murdered Jesus by hanging him on a tree, and all this is going on. And this Pharisee named Gamaliel intercedes on the apostles' behalf, says, hey, look, he calms the Sanhedrin down, and he says, look, if this thing is from God, you can't stop it by stoning Peter to death, because they wanted to kill Peter after this speech. Which is also some evidence that Peter was risking his safety, even his life, in this speech, if there's any historical accuracy. So I don't want to deny that. But Gamaliel says, look, this is from God. You can't stop it. And if it isn't from God, it's going to die out and go away. So I would say that gets my attention. Like, it didn't die out, did it? We're still 2,000 years ago talking about Jesus, very robustly talking about Jesus, studying Jesus, and coming up with these arguments. So I know that one gives me a moment of pause. Gamaliel's comments are still well received in 2,000 years. So, I'll give you a point for that. But as far as the empty tomb, I don't even think there was a tomb. I think that's a legendary story. I think the resurrection is a legendary story. So that's my comments.
Okay. I would say is that the sheer fact that there was an explosion of Christianity, like you can't deny that one point in time, that because Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism. It is the answer to all of the prophecies, which there's a whole other subject that you can bring up of I think there's 400 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled in the life of the Gospels and stuff like that, where they've done calculations on what the probability of a normal person doing it. It's like it's nothing. It's zero. You can't do it. But the fact that we went from, like, we're talking about strict Jews, like these guys they know their gospel, they know their scriptures, they know this, they have the hierarchy, everything is there, all the pressure is pushing towards this, and then all of a sudden, boom, within 50 years of this, you've got you've got Christians in Rome. There's writings of in Pompeii of Christians. In Pompeii, I believe Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. Like, we've got Christians and a prevalent Christian community in Pompeii. We've got Christians in Spain. We have Christians all throughout northern Africa and Egypt. Like, it is exploded in such a short period of time. And I forget which historian said this, but a legend usually takes about at least two generations to become what it is. We're talking months, if not like just a few years of this happening, and all of a sudden you've got people talking about the resurrection. I noticed in your opening you mentioned the 40 days. I don't know where you get that. I might be mishearing you.
Acts chapter 1.
Acts chapter 1, the 40 days of when Jesus was between his resurrection and his ascension into heaven.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Okay. So in that time, this is actually not kind of going towards the question, but I'll ask this question in a little bit. But that
okay.
Previous.
Yeah, I lost track if I get to rebut your thing about the explosion of Christianity, or if that was.
This was my question rebutting your answer.
Your question rebutting my answer. Okay, so is it my turn to ask you a question, or should I rebut what you just said?
Do you want? if you want, you can rebut.
Listen, the only thing I'm going to say is the spread of Christianity. I live in Southern California. When you drive down the Santa Ana Freeway, it's the Santa Ana Freeway, and you pass, you pass Juana Paracera High School. You pass El Camino Real. You pass, Los Cristianitos Road as you're driving south down the I-5 freeway. The reason why you see all these Spanish names is because the king sent a bunch of conquistadores over here with Father Juana Paracera, and they oppressed the Native Americans who had been living here for 10,000 years. The Santa Ana Freeway should not be the Santa Ana Freeway. It should be the Anawani Freeway, and all of those names should be Native American names, because Christianity has very frequently attached itself to an oppressive military government, and they've spread the gospel through a system of carrots and sticks. Be nice to the Native Americans and then beat them up when they don't accept your particular religion. Oppress their languages, oppress their cultures, and you have the military backing you up when they start to revolt against that. So that's a lot of and I live in Southern California, where that is the historical way that Christianity established itself, from, San Francisco to the Mexican border. So I don't think it's necessarily a nice religion that, is open arms to every people. It is a religion for everybody, but it's also a religion with a fair amount of oppression and forcing itself upon people.
Do you want to ask another question since?
Oh, sure. Okay. Let's see here. All right. Let's see. Resurrection stories are commonplace in the New Testament. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Stories of John the Baptist being raised from the dead are in Mark chapter 6. Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. Paul raises Eutychus from the dead. Peter raises Tabitha from the dead. In Matthew's gospel, it says all of the saints are raised from their graves and are allegedly seen by people walking around Jerusalem. Although it's not in the New Testament, there are numerous stories about the Virgin Mary appearing before individual people and groups of people. So we have these commonplace stories of resurrections in the New Testament, and then even people today who are seeing, and in groups as well, saying, we saw the Virgin Mary. Do you believe all of these resurrection stories are all historically accurate and that they actually happened?
I would say, other than the Virgin Mary, I would say, yeah, the Bible says that they did happen. So I would say yes. I'm a little fuzzy on the John the Baptist. What's the Bible verses for that one?
Yeah, you'll find it in Mark chapter 6. Now, I want to be clear about this. And that's saying that there's stories going around about John the Baptist having been raised from the dead. And there's this illusion that possibly John the Baptist is raised from the dead in the form of Jesus. But it's vague, unclear. But it is in the Gospels that there's the author writes there's stories of John the Baptist being raised from the dead. So it's just one of the stories of resurrections.
If I'm correct, isn't that from the priests and Pharisees' perspective? It's like, hey, Herod's perspective, where it's like, hey, we just killed John the Baptist. Why are we getting these reports about this again? So
yeah, you're right about the context of that, but it is one of the New Testament pieces of information that there's stories going around. Somebody's saying that John the Baptist rose from the dead, although I do admit it's vague, it's unclear, and it's odd, but it's there.
I would say yes. I have no reason to not. Like, if I was trying to find a naturalistic answer for that, like, I wouldn't have one for you because it's not a naturalistic situation. So yes, I would say they did, because we're talking about the Son of God and a very divine period in time. And yes.
Okay. My only rebuttal to be with that, I find a great deal of consistency that evangelicals and Protestants will robustly say, yes, this was in the Bible, it absolutely happened. These resurrections of people coming back to life after they've dying are totally true. Protestants themselves would say, well, John the Baptist, not enough evidence for that.
Well,
But then this,
sorry.
uh,
Do you
but
mind,
then
do you
this,
mind if I, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, my bad.
yeah, but then the exact same people who are utterly convinced that all of these resurrections are true will immediately deny that Catholics who see the Virgin Mary, that's not true. So this is this selective, very selective, self-serving identification of resurrections that actually happened and resurrections that are just the figment of people's imaginations. I find it self-serving. Go ahead, though. What were you going to say?
Oh, I would say it's like when it comes to like the selecting of who to believe and stuff. One is, I have no doubt that people see things like, and I'm sure you wouldn't doubt hallucinations and stuff of people seeing stuff. Now, when it comes to that stuff, we have documented in the Bible, and that is stated, and it's consistent with Scripture. Now, when I come to refuting the people who say they've seen the Virgin Mary and stuff like that, it's not consistent with Scripture, and it's not. I'm not Catholic, so when I hear a Catholic bring up like, oh, we should be praying to the Virgin Mary and stuff like that, my answer is chapter and verse, and so yeah, that would be my argument for that. And then for John the Baptist, from my recollection, I don't remember like anyone explicitly claiming it was John the Baptist, like other than maybe Herod saying like, didn't we just kill John the Baptist? What is he doing back? Because John the Baptist is known as the coming of Elijah. He's the next Elijah. Not that he's physically Elijah, but he's the coming of Elijah.
Yeah,
and so,
I admit those stories. It's vague even in the gospel, but it is. There are stories going around. But at any rate, I don't want to be too redundant about that. All right, let's see. I think you get to ask me a question.
All right. If the resurrection was a fabrication, why would the apostles risk their lives, often facing persecution and death, to proclaim it? Why would they just do it?
Yeah, okay, so I think this is a really good question. I do not want to come off as that the apostles weren't taking any risks at all, that there are some stories about Stephen being stoned to death, and that is a clear martyrdom because he is preaching the Christian faith. And I might be a little bit out of school or even wrong, but I think he is insulting the Jews by calling them murderers, but I could be confusing that with Peter. I am very confident Peter is insulting them, telling them that they, have killed the prophets before them. So yes, indeed, the Christians, whatever they were doing, those early Christians were ruffling people's feathers. I would point out, though, that they weren't ruffling the big dog's feathers, that John's gospel is very nice to the Romans. So Romans are the big dogs at that particular time, right? If you made the Romans mad, you were in big trouble. But preaching the gospel does not seem to be a thing that makes the Romans mad. And this really comes out in John's gospel. Pontius Pilate says, this man has done nothing wrong. It's the Jews that are the bad guys. And this is really a problem because it's caused so much anti-Semitism throughout the world. I have a YouTube video about the moral arguments where Adolf Hitler literally, he quotes Jesus on this, fighting the Jews. And that's where he got the idea. So this has not been without damage. My argument is that people will take risks for profit and prestige, and the apostles were. There's evidence there that they were getting profit. They were making a living from this. People take risks for that. And the Romans, being the big dogs, weren't actually going and persecuting. It was the Jews that were persecuting the apostles, the littler dogs. There's even a story in the book of Acts of Peter's arrest. The apostles are there. And the temple guards, the Jewish temple guards, don't use any force on the apostles because they were afraid of the crowd that they had. So Peter is charismatic enough to get a bunch of followers that's sufficient that the crowd and the temple guards are afraid of them, and they don't use any force on them. When you look at these, the apostles are flogged after their trial in front of the Sanhedrin. but they're joyous afterwards. They're able to go preach the gospel from house to house and from place to place immediately afterwards. So you're kind of like, well, I mean, this doesn't sound like they were beaten bloody. When you start to read the stories of Peter being imprisoned, he's not in prison for very long, sometimes less than 24 hours or a couple of days at the absolute most. He gets out of prison, and it was a badge of honor that he was even in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And their ministry goes on for, maybe 3 decades before any of them die, and we don't have really good accounts of their death. So all these stories about, bloody persecution and everybody's out to get them, I'm looking at the stories that we actually have the evidence that we have to add. And yes, there is some persecution. I don't deny that. But how bloody is it? And it doesn't include martyrdom, and they were benefiting from it, and the same stories give that information. And I would say, hey, you know what? Starting a new religion or a new sect within Judaism is going to ruffle feathers. There's risk involved.
Mm-hmm.
But my thing is no, they would have taken risks. Joseph Smith took risks. All these religious founders have taken some real significant risks. The apostles are just in that boat of people who, for whatever reasons, I think that they wanted power. At least for Peter, he's kind of like a cult leader. I've said this too many times already. Yeah. That's my answer to your question about them being willing to die.
Well, I would say that the location in which they are announcing this, like if I was going to go and announce something towards as a fulfillment or a messiah of some sort of Judaism, I wouldn't be announcing it in Jerusalem or anywhere near Jerusalem. Like I would probably be announcing it as in far and talking about rather far away, because Jerusalem is probably the hardest nut to crack if you were going to try and start a religion in. Like Jerusalem is very strongly Jewish. They follow the law. They have all the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. They're all there teaching this, and yet they professed it in Jerusalem, and people believed them, like a big enough following. I think a lot of the times where you hear of the temple guards not wanting to like cause any problems with them is that people are following them because they believe it. They're like, hey, this is true. This is like, I think I saw like the 500 eyewitnesses, which Paul is attesting to in Corinthians. Those are probably the people who are in Jerusalem or around. They're like, hey, I saw him. I'm attesting this to other. Now, why we don't have eyewitness like written down things from these people is that we're moving from a very oral tradition to a written tradition. And so it would make sense that we wouldn't see all 500 eyewitnesses testimonies written down, but we would still see like passed down stories and testimonies going down. And if we want to look at like sheer number of documentation, like the early church fathers had a huge habit of writing commentary to the point where you could reconstruct the early Bible within 200 years of the crucifixion, and you could fill it out without anything else from that. And so the belief of this is like they're there. They truly believe this, and that the crowds are moving with them along with this. Now, I think I might have moved off to a little bit off the question, but
all right, that's okay. Okay, I just have one more thing. It's question.
Okay.
Is that where we're at?
I think so. I think I asked the last one.
Okay, it kind of marries into a little bit of they truly believe this comment that you're making, but what did they actually truly believe? I think when you read certainly Mark and Matthew, they truly believed that the world was going to end and that God's kingdom was going to arrive. But that's my question. John the Baptist Jesus and Paul all seem to believe that the world was about to end and God's kingdom was about to arrive. I think that's what they believed. But what are your comments?
My comments is that we see Jesus mentioned the 1,000 years, and we see in Revelations, which is John writing what a returning Jesus has come to him and is telling him, write this, and he's writing this to all the churches, and it's very apocalyptic in a lot of its writings in Revelations, but we're seeing that he's at the end of the age. He mentions the age. He mentions like the time will come when this happens. The time will come when this happens, and yeah, a lot of people believed like that this is going to happen. Jesus himself says, "Not even the Son knows the time of his return." Which I'm not saying that Jesus doesn't know that now, but maybe when he was on earth, he didn't know, or maybe I don't know how to interpret that. Mm-hmm. But we see that he's very be ready at all times, because this could happen now. This could happen other. We see when it comes to prophecies and promises, God tends to have, hey, if you do this, this will happen. But if you do this, this will happen. Kind of like a conditional prophecy. Like with Jerusalem, with Israel, his prophecy, his promise to them was, follow me, don't follow other gods, and you will be a great nation. And the Bible and history attest to the reign of Solomon, and then they would fall away, and then bad things would happen, and then they would come back to God, and good things would happen, and they would come back, and then they would fall away, and then bad things would happen. And so in the New Testament, we have a lot of criteria that has to happen before Jesus will come back. And so I think that Jesus's warnings of being ready at all time may have been interpreted as, hey, he's going to come back at any time. He's going to be back here soon. But doesn't necessarily mean that he was going to come back soon.
Mm-hmm. I get to kind of do a rebuttal. Jesus actually directly states this in Mark and Matthew's gospel, that this generation will not pass away until the kingdom of God arrives with power and authority. If you look at all of Jesus's teachings, very frequently you see a pattern that nothing is important because God's kingdom is here. Leave your family, leave your wife, leave your children, leave your farms, because you're not going to need any of those things. God's kingdom is here. This is pronounced in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, and it's also really well stated. John the Baptist, he says the axe is at the foot of the tree, that God's kingdom is here. Paul actually in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he's telling people, don't even get married. Don't get married. That's going to distract you from God, and that's important because the time is short. These are all the things that are saying over and over and over again. And then when you get to Luke, it's toned down a little bit. John, it's pretty much eliminated altogether. And I think these are later gospels where that's no longer the story that's working. Your comment of 1,000 years, that's from 1 Peter. And I think it's more of an excuse. Who are these scoffers who say that, God's kingdom is going to be here since the beginning of time? Everything goes on as it always has been. These are, like, oh, this is getting to be such a problem. We're now having to write excuses for it. And if this whole 1,000 years, I talk to modern Christians. I don't talk to them. I hear modern Christians, Jesus is coming back any day now. He's going to be here. He's going to straighten this horrible mess out. We have all these sinful practices going on. Well, if this is true, Jesus has been dead for 2,000 years. If a day is 1,000 years, 3 days seems to be somewhat of a thing in the Gospels. Jesus rises on the third day. Well, modern Christians, you got 1,000 years to wait. So stop talking about Jesus's imminent return, because that's the same thing that Jesus was talking about, that God's kingdom is imminently going to get here. It didn't show up. I think this is some evidence that John the Baptist, Jesus, and Paul just simply miscalculated the end of the age and the coming of God's kingdom, very much in the same way that modern Christians are doing that, when they probably have another 1,000, maybe another 10,000 years before he shows up. It's not going to be in their lifetime. Joseph of Arimathea ultimately was disappointed. If you read Luke's gospel, he was there to see the arrival of God's kingdom, and it didn't show up. So if Jesus was teaching these things, he let some people down, Joseph of Arimathea being an example of that.
I would like to respond with the 1,000 years is often used as like an anecdote for a very long time, or 1,000 years from now, what's going to happen, kind of. And I would say that we see that a lot, where I wouldn't take it as a literal 1,000 years. I would take it as, and he mentions like the end of this age and just generation. I might need to reread through some of that part there just to
Fair
get
enough.
context about that. And then the day is like 1,000 years to the Lord. I believe Peter's talking about like what it will be like in heaven, where it's like time is not really going to be consideration, really.
Mhm.
But it in of itself, it doesn't really pertain too much, where we're called to be ready at all times, because Jesus says, if Jesus literally meant 1,000 years, then we would know, okay, in 1,000 years, this is happening. In 1,000 years, all right. And they would start counting down their clock. And a lot of people did. A lot of people did count down their clocks. And then when it didn't happen, it was like, oh, what happened? But then we see Jesus say, but the Son of Man will come like a thief in the night. Or so always be ready. Like, this is what's going to happen. It's going to come when nobody expects it. Or it's going to come when you don't expect it. It's going to happen. It's not going to be this thing where you're predicting it down to the minute, where it's like, all right, guys, we only got 20 more minutes until Jesus comes back. It's happening when it happens, and you won't know when. You won't know the day. You won't know the hour when it happens. And so.
All right. Do you have a final question for me?
I think I asked the first question, didn't I?
You did. I lost track of all this stuff.
Yeah.
You got a lot going on. Well, listen, we did kind of agree to, like, I think we have really talked about a lot of stuff, and I'm hoping you're good with this, unless there's something that you wanted to say, summing it up. But we're going on about 2 hours now, and
yeah, we got a lot of
starting to hurt, actually. I'm motivated to
my tailbone's going to hurt a little bit.
Yeah, right. He was.
Yeah.
But I mean, we could talk for. This is not getting resolved.
Yeah.
This afternoon by any chance. But I think you did a great job. I mean, there's work to be done, but I compliment you on your biblical knowledge and able to respond to some of these arguments. I don't agree with you, and I think some of them are a little on the bogus side. But hey, you didn't just sit there and cry or anything, so that's great.
I mean, my rebuttals need work.
Yeah. And you'll get much better. Who knows? So yeah, you don't know where you're going to be. I mean, we don't know where we're going to be. You got to work hard, do your best, and keep it at that. But I've enjoyed the conversation with you.